Singapore was that they have become an unbelievable country. I mean, Zimbabwe started its independence in a much stronger position than Singapore at about the same time.
Yeah.
Look at Zimbabwe now, look at Singapore now.
Yeah.
What is the difference? And I went there and I looked very hard to see why Zimbabwe had gone back to trading with cattle and goats and swapping things, barter system for other goods. And Singapore had the strongest currency in the world. And I looked at the reasons why, because Zimbabwe had far more when they became independent than Singapore, from the same British colonialists.
Yeah. So what did they get right in Singapore?
A lot.
Guys, so Helen Zille in this podcast with Mark G, really interesting podcast, guys. Mark G, kudos to Mark G, guys, for bringing the Iron Lady to his platform to really speak. And she really brought out the energy, the youth, the Gen Z energy into this podcast. I really enjoyed her, the way she broke down a lot of things, really came down to this level of the Gen Z, the kind that Mark G tries to really propagate in his podcasts, and really spoke a lot. Gave out a lot of knowledge about South Africa in this one. I'll put the entire podcast in the show notes. It's 2 hours long. I know you guys won't have time, but I'll be analyzing some parts of the video which speak to me a lot, especially as one who is hungry to really understand South Africa from a perspective of a West African who is really naive and trying to really understand the society in South Africa. And so one of the things Helen Zille is actually breaking down here was, I think there was a tweet she made some years ago that almost broke the internet, where she somewhat alluded to the idea that probably that colonialism had some legacy which probably shouldn't have been destroyed. And in this podcast here, she's really trying to respond to that question. I see a lot of sense in what she's saying, because you see, one of the things that really marvel when I look at the history of Nigeria, especially this city called Lagos, during the colonial era, the order, the neatness, the way it was structured and all that, compared to, although now Nigeria, especially many cities in Lagos, especially in the new Lagos, those of you who might know Lagos or who have been visiting Lagos, you know about the new Lagos. It's called kind of like the new city anyway, the likes of Banana Island and all of that. That's where really new real estate boom is taking place. Really classy houses in Lagos there. There are really lots of order, but when you come to the old Lagos, you know, it's easy to still find a lot of disorder and all that in those areas, all right? One of the things Helen Zille is actually pointing out, and I saw this difference during the time in the colonial era from the 1950s, even if you go to YouTube and check out for videos of Lagos, 1940s, 45, 50s, because Nigeria got its independence in 1960. The order, bro, I was so surprised. There were bicycle lanes and all of that. There was a structure, you know, compared to after the independence era, the time when, you know, with the independent rule, so to speak, it was a challenge for many of the leaders at the time to really develop their own way of living. And at the end of the day, in the attempt to replace the colonial structures that were already in place at the time, we saw a lot of chaos in Nigeria. For example, we saw the first military coup in 1966 on January the 15th, thereabout, when the military, some of the military cadets, the military brigadiers at the time really thought that, you know, Nigeria was already sinking just 6 years into its independence, and the center couldn't hold anymore. So we saw the first military coup, and then it was coup after coup after coup until 1999, when Nigeria became stable under the presidency of General Olusegun Obasanjo, all right? So these were the kind of things that Nigeria, in its sense, grappled with as a result of independent rule and its attempt to really establish self-governance, especially with the majority black rule now. So what Helen Zille is trying to explain, I think, in this, and I don't want to spill out all the beans. I want you guys to listen to yourself, because this is an education. This video here is an education full of knowledge, all right? So she speaks about Singapore and Zimbabwe. The story of Singapore is something I have. Lee Kuan Yew, the first president of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, I have his biographies. I study the man's life. It's insane what that country was able to achieve, the discipline the people had to endure and all of that. I remember growing up, one of my mother's because my mother used to do this sewing. She had a sewing machine. In Nigeria, we call it sewing machine. I don't know how you guys call it in South Africa. But, I always remember that whenever she tried to mend our clothes on that machine and all that, I would always see the sign on the legs of that machine. It was always written Singapore. So in other words, I think it was manufactured in Singapore. So as at that time, they had already been producing, manufacturing, and all of that. And at that time, now that I'm grown up, trying to really recollect those, Nigeria was an import society, while Singapore had been manufacturing things like sewing machines. I don't even think in Nigeria there are kind of like productive capabilities that likes to produce a sewing machine to export. All right. I think most of the things Nigeria exports today might be probably our music, culture, heritage, and all of that. But in terms of productive capacity, I think it's about the same in South Africa. Although I know that the steel is something that actually has been produced, but we see the ArcelorMittal, the battle ArcelorMittal is actually facing now. The tariffs are landing. Today is the 1st of August. The tariffs, Donald Trump's 30% tariffs are landing in South Africa today. I think plus a 10% tariff for South Africa's alignment with what Donald Trump calls BRICS anti-America policies. So I really don't know how the productive capacity of South Africa's industry will be, probably in the short term or the long term. But what Helen Zille is actually trying to allude to is the difference between Zimbabwe and Singapore, in the sense that they both had independence at about the same time, although that was a little bit tricky until I checked, because I know Mugabe would come into power from the 80s thereabout, all right? But I think what she meant here was the idea of the fact that by 1965, Zimbabwe already had the unilateral declaration of independence. This would be by the Ian Smith government, breaking away from British rule, all right, where we saw the prowess of minority rule in Zimbabwe at that time, from 65 all the way till we had the Bush War, and then Mugabe comes in. At the same time as well, and I think this would be Helen Zille's argument, that at about 1965 as well, Singapore had its full independence from from 9th of August 1965, after it separated from Malaysia. So in other words, it became a self-government in 1959. It tagged along and joined Malaysia by 63, but then by 65 it separated from Malaysia and became a standalone country. Really difficult time for its people. They had to get disciplined. I think there was a point where I think there was a percentage, I think if not 43% or 53%, that the people had to save. This was a mandatory saving of their hard made income. They had to save it in the bank, so to speak, so that there could be leverage for the government to start building on. It's not as if they were giving this money to the bank, but there had to be a savings culture. So Lee Kuan Yew, I think I would argue that the economy was trying to reduce its amount of borrowing, but really depend on the productive capabilities of his people. And, that was one of the policies. I think Lee Kuan Yew even shared a personal story about how a CIA operative tried to bribe one of the officials working in Singapore at this time when it was trying to build its economy. And that guy was honest enough to really come to give that information to Lee Kuan Yew, and the revolution was almost sabotaged. Now, let's just watch that.
We caught an American CIA agent trying to subvert our intelligence special branch officer. Bribe him so that the special branch officer will feed the CIA, because the CIA wants to know what's happening. I mean, subverting a Singapore officer. The man might have succeeded, but I'm proud to say that the officer offered large sum of money and continuing sums of money. This was in 1960. Refused and reported the matter to his chief, who reported it to me. Man was caught, locked up. And I told the American government, all right, we keep quiet, you take this man away. $100 million to the Singapore government for economic development.
So at the end of the day, what Helen Zille is trying to say is that, both countries had independence from this one entity, the British, in the same year. Yet, while one has attained a level of success to the point where I think it has the strongest passports in the world, all right, one of them is actually struggling. She points out that, Zimbabwe actually returned to trade by barter system and all of that. And what was the reason? It was because of what she's explaining now in this video, which I think is really important for all South Africans on this channel. Whether you're black, white, Indian, or color, whether you have a prejudice for white people or for black people, I think this is an education that we all have to understand. Because you see, when I listen to the likes of Ike Kumalo, he speaks a lot about, it's almost like a nostalgia for the period during the apartheid rule. I'm not saying that apartheid was good in itself, but even Vusi Tembekwayo speak about a certain kind of structure, the machinery, the orchestrators of the apartheid machine, all right, had a certain system of order to which, if that machine had carried through, throwing away the segregation and all of that, bro, the kind of country we would have had in South Africa would have been something else. But unfortunately, we saw it all crumble, and Helen Zille is actually explaining there was an entity, there was a part of that whole crumbling, which Helen Zille is now alluding to the fact that makes the difference to why South Africa, to why Zimbabwe and Singapore had an independence from the British, which is a colonial system at the same time, but yet one country rose to the peak and is still rising while the other is struggling to stand. Let's have this.
That's sad.
Do you still believe the country was better under apartheid?
When did I ever say that?
You tweeted it a little while back.
What?
Yeah, you
You
remember.
see,
Should have pulled up the tweets.
this is a total and 100% lie. I will give you R1,000,000 if you can find a tweet where I said the country was better under apartheid.
Yeah.
The country was much better after apartheid.
Yeah.
And even under Jacob Zuma, the country was better than under apartheid.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, please, it's just ridiculous how you say one perfectly honest thing that is true, and it grows legs and arms and a bulbous nose and horns and a devil's tail.
Yeah.
Nonsense. I said when they were all running around saying, decolonize the universities, scrap this, science must fall. I said, hey, hold on a moment. We do this at our peril, decolonizing everything. I said, the legacy of colonialism is not only negative. Now, obviously, that means a hell of a lot was negative.
Of course.
But let's keep the stuff that wasn't. Formal education is a legacy. Hospitals are a legacy. Electricity generation is a legacy. Piped water is a legacy. Shall we get rid of all of that in the name of decolonization? Universities are a legacy. Are we going to get rid of the universities? Science are we going to get rid of science? No. And one thing that I learned in Singapore was that they have become an unbelievable country. I mean, Zimbabwe started its independence in a much stronger position than Singapore at about the same time.
Yeah.
Look at Zimbabwe now, look at Singapore now.
Yeah.
What is the difference? And I went there and I looked very hard to see why Zimbabwe had gone back to trading with cattle and goats and swapping things, barter system, for other goods. And Singapore had the strongest currency in the world. And I looked at the reasons why, because Zimbabwe had far more when they became independent than Singapore, from the same British colonialists.
Yeah. So what did they get right in Singapore?
A lot of things.
Yeah.
And one of the things they get right is that they didn't break down everything they inherited from the British. They took them over and they built them up into the best institutions in the world. So that's what I was saying. I was saying, take what you inherit from the past, even if a lot of the past was bad, and take what you can build on and make it better. That is the point. And that's what they did. They inherited these whites-only, second-rate technical colleges from the British in Singapore, and they've turned them into the best institutions in the world.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
So what
Don't
do you
break
think,
down everything.
So what do you think, according to you, led to the demise of the apartheid regime?
The
According
apartheid
to you?
regime.
Yeah.
Well, there were many factors. Many factors. You just have to read External Mission by Stephen Ellis to find out that what the ANC was really like in exile, but we'll leave that now there in brackets. There were many things. First of all, there were fundamental and inherent contradictions. The idea about apartheid was to get separate independent states for all the ethnic groups in South Africa. A state for the Xhosas, a state for the Zulus, a state for the Tswanas. Well, there's Botswana already. There's a state for, and there's Lesotho already, as we already know, and for the Venda and all of that, as you know. And then separate all of these places out into separate states. But it was a madness because there was one economy in South Africa. If you have one integrated economy, it's incredibly difficult to make separate political entities. And then, because the economy was growing in the main urban centers, people were living outside of the countries in which they were supposed to be affiliated, so-called. So that made no sense as well. So there were so many inherent contradictions, and there was no way that, given the economy was growing very fast in the 1960s and 70s, especially in Johannesburg, Durban, those were the two main conurbations, to a lesser extent Cape Town, they were growing and people were flocking to the cities. There was no way that you were going to put political separation based on economic integration. It couldn't work, right? So that was the first contradiction. The second contradiction is that the vast majority of the population didn't want it. And the third contradiction was that the world didn't want it.
Yeah.
And you can't be a tiny minority in a country trying, like King Canute, to push back the tide. It doesn't work that way.